I am very excited to speak a little bit about negotiation for a variety of different reasons, but I think the biggest one is that I was absolutely awful at it when I began practicing law and then through the years, and it became incredibly interesting to me only because it was so challenging. I think I had the biggest problem with negotiating because I always thought that the answer I came up with often was if we had a piece of litigation we were trying to settle and I couldn't get exactly what I thought was the fair number, then we would just go to court, because that was one of the alternatives to resolving everything. It turns out that probably wasn't the best thing for either me or for my clients, and as a result I started studying a little bit about negotiation. What I'm going to try to do for you today is to summarize maybe 100 different books, articles, and periodicals that I've read over time about negotiation and the way that it works. The one thing I can tell you from the very start is that this is not a one-size-fits-all kind of program. I don't think that the techniques and tactics that we're going to discuss today are the things that are going to work every single time, and they're certainly not going to work on every single person. But I hope that we walk away from here with a little bit of more knowledge about negotiation and some tools that'll help us get to the next step. Those of you that have taken continuing education classes from me know that I never like to start a CE class and now any webinar without at least talking a little bit about why we're here. To me, we're not going to have a test at the end of this. I'm going to answer questions at the end of it if anybody has any, but we're not going to have a test, so there's not a goal for you to score high on a test, and you certainly don't have to memorize the things that we're talking about. Really, the prize here is knowledge, and that's, I think, in its own right, a good goal to have. If anybody needs any of the information that I'm going to talk about today, I can try to give you the resources and some of the other periodicals and books if you just email me and ask me for that information. I will also say that, as most of you know that have taken any CE classes from me, I prefer to use the who, what, where, when, why, and how method of analyzing almost any problem, whether it's drafting a contract or figuring out what kind of car to buy. It simplifies things for me, and particularly with anything that's legal in nature, it makes sure that you don't miss anything. So I've always used that methodology in looking at things, and I think you're going to get a sense of that today. This next slide, obviously you can say you're going to find your answer when you answer all the questions of who, what, where, when, why, and how. It'll at least get you going in the right direction, and hopefully it'll get you to your desired result. Now we're going to do a 3-hour webinar to talk about some basic skills for negotiating. Do you see what I did to you there? I talked about a webinar and I talked about 3 hours. All of you that signed up, I think, are fairly aware that this is a 1-hour negotiation webinar. And the whole concept here was, how did it make you feel when you heard me say 3 hours? Probably out of, I think there are 336 people that are listening right now. Probably at least half of you were paying enough attention to hear that I did say 3 hours instead of 1 hour. But how did it make you feel? Imagine if you were in a negotiation with someone and you were able to make them feel that same way. Is that going to get you to your goal? Is it going to hurt you in going towards your goal? I think what it does in a lot of ways is it makes you sit there and think to yourself, oh my gosh, do I actually have 3 hours to devote to negotiation when I'm not going to get any credit for it? Do I have to pick up my kids at 3:30? Am I going to make it or not? So there are a lot of things that will go through your head. Now, why do I not use that technique of lying to someone about the substance of what we're going to discuss in order to get there? Well, I think it's fairly obvious. It's an integrity question and something that I just don't feel like is the right way to approach a problem. But think about the technique. Without lying to someone, you can have some impact, you can have some effect, and sort of adjust their behavior a little bit by the things that you're actually talking about and the things that you're trying to say. Now, what would it have made you feel like if I had said we were going to actually have a written test at the end of this? Would that have helped you? Would it have made you sit up straighter, maybe pull out a pen and a piece of paper to try to take some notes? Maybe it would have, maybe it wouldn't have. Let's go to something even scarier. Purportedly, one of the most feared things of human beings is to stand up in front of a group and speak. And what if I had said to you that I'm going to pick one or every one of you and ask you to come up on stage or ask you to join in the webinar and recite part of what we'd already discussed? Would that make you pay a little bit more attention, or wouldn't it? So I think you get a sense just from this very beginning and the original topics that we're going to discuss in negotiation that this is very much a psychology and a way of getting along with other people, and how do you influence the other people and how are they going to influence you. I'm a big definitional person, so I always like to talk about what is the topic that we're talking about. What is a negotiation? I have seen so many different definitions of negotiation, and a lot of the times they will talk about the Latin origins of that, and I am not going to bore you with too much Latin. I've got two words that we're going to use a little bit later in the presentation that are in Latin. I'll apologize to you already, but they really tell a lot, I think, about it. But I'm not going to do that with the definition of negotiation. Negotiation, really simply, is the process of getting what you need or want from someone else. Now, the corollary to that, obviously, is that they might want to get something they need or want from you at the same time. And I threw a couple things down here that are sort of examples. But let's start with wants and needs. Those are two very, very different things, and I think part of the discussion we're going to have today is how do you get ready to negotiate with someone? And I think you have to define your wants and needs pretty carefully. Needs are going to be something that don't go away. They're the only thing that really matters in this. They're the must-haves. The wants are the things that would make So if someone has to have a garage, that becomes a need. Making it a two-car garage might become a want. And they're in two totally different categories, because you should be more prepared to give away a want, but you're not going to be prepared to give away a need. And defining those is the most important thing when you start. The point of this slide also is that we're negotiating in every single aspect of our lives, whether we realize it or not. Whether you're at work, there's a dichotomy there between you as an employee and your employer. You want more money. Your employer wants to pay less money. You want to work less and take more vacation, and your employer wants you to work more and take less vacation. So there's definitely a big difference there. We can say the same thing about a marriage. The only way that a marriage or other personal relationship is going to work is by negotiating. Who's going to make dinner? Who's going to do the dishes? Who's going to watch the kids? Who's going to pay what bills or contribute to what other factor in the relationship matters really makes a big difference. And figuring out how to make sure that that works is the most important part of those relationships. And finally, obviously, whenever you're going to buy absolutely anything, there is a negotiation involved. Unless, and actually, even if you're willing to just walk up and pay whatever the price might be, that's a short-circuited and probably not a fantastic method of negotiation, but that's a negotiation too, and it applies to buying cars, office supplies, getting a hotel room, an airline ticket, or even a trinket from a street vendor. Across the board, you're negotiating on a regular basis. So this becomes a really important technique or tactic to learn, at least to understand that it's going on. I think that many of us sort of rush through life not actually realizing that we really are negotiating on a daily basis, pretty much on almost anything that we're doing every day. A lot of people will look at negotiation and say, you know, the reason why I want to be a good negotiator is because I want to win. Well, that might work with a one-time transaction where you only have a one-off relationship with anybody, but I'm not so sure that it's the best thing in the world to look at as a goal for negotiation. there isn't really a win in the sense that there's also a loser in negotiation. In negotiation, we try to get the win-win scenario. So it doesn't really mean that you're going to be beating the other side. I also think that the most important part about a win is defining what it means. For many years, I had a criminal law practice, some of it doing public defender work and sometimes doing private clients. And if you defined a win as going to court and getting acquittal for your client, you were going to be a very, very disappointed attorney, and your clients were going to be very disappointed as well. So you had to look at every single case and define what a win was. I learned that fairly early on. I had a 9th offense DUI client, and that was most likely not going to turn out to be a win if I defined it in terms of him having no impact or influence on his ultimate life. So we had to define win as, was he going to keep a driver's license, and if so, how long would he have lost it? Was there going to be jail time involved? Was there going to be home detention or other programs? So you really truly have to define what a win is going to mean to you. And when you're representing clients, when you're doing representative negotiation, you have to define with your client what a win is going to be. For you, it might be getting a house for $345,000 or getting a fast settlement date because your clients need to get into a house quickly. But defining that from the very beginning is going to be a crucial component in deciding whether you've actually gotten that win or not. I also learned some lessons early on in a firm I worked in where they did a lot of transactional work, and that's basically drafting contracts and drafting deals. It was incredibly fun work, but I was a little bit unaccustomed to the technique because I was primarily doing litigation. And in litigation, when you're going to go to court, it really is kind of about beating the other side. It's about convincing a judge that he or she should say that you were the winner of the litigation. And the thought was that if I drafted the toughest, meanest, most difficult contract in the world that was absolutely airtight and favored my client 100%, I could count on one thing almost certainly, and that is that my client would never get the deal. They would never get the transaction taken care of. They would never fulfill their goal of making the deal happen. So some of the other partners talked to me about it a little bit, and I started to understand that there was something a little bit more to this transactional work than beating the other side. A lot of times it was about getting together a really fair agreement that not only helped my client, but also satisfied the needs of the person on the other side. It really makes a huge difference when you look at things that way. I broke this down into 4 separate steps for negotiation: preparing for negotiation, conducting the negotiation, terminating a negotiation, and then finalizing the negotiation. And I think that obviously that's in chronological order of how you're going to approach any kind of negotiation. So let's just talk a little bit about what we're discussing here on preparing, conducting, terminating, and finalizing a negotiation. Now, preparing for, there's some little tidbits that I found in a book. The most important one, I think, is this one at the top, and that's goals. What do you want, and what do they want? The most important thing that you're going to go forward in the negotiation to prepare is to try to find that out. Now, again, when we're dealing with real estate transactions, sometimes we're not going to get a lot of detailed information, but you can scour the Maris listing for a particular property and find out as much information as you possibly can as a buyer's agent on what that seller wants. You know what the listing price is going to be. There could be other information that the listing agent has put in there for you. Obviously, if you're a listing agent, you can help other buyer's agents and buyers in deciding whether this property works by identifying things like a quick settlement is welcome, or seller needs 6 extra months in order to move out. Providing that information from the very beginning lets them know what you're looking for in the particular property. And once you know what the other side wants, and once you know what your side wants, it is much easier to put together an agreement, a negotiated agreement that's going to work for both sides. Part of the negotiation is oftentimes looking at what you are willing to give away, what kind of trades you can have. And again, when we're talking about real estate transactions, it could be that quick settlement. I was involved in a personal transaction not very long ago where the buyer came to me and said, I want your house, but I need you out in 5 days. And I sort of laughed and said, that's really great. I'm glad you want me out in 5 days, but we've lived here for 13 years. It's a 5-bedroom house. It's filled with all of our stuff. It's tucked away pretty much everywhere, and I don't see how it's possible that we can get out of here in 5 days. And then he offered me a price that was significantly more than our asking price. Amazingly, we found a way to get out of there in 5 days. So that was something I didn't even know I was willing to give away, but I was able to give it away. Alternatives is something that if you don't reach an agreement or you aren't able to reach an agreement, what are you going to do? And that's sort of the safety net that I think most people need to have. If you're representing a seller, the seller needs to know, what if it does take 700 days on market before this property sells? What are we going to do in that meantime? Should we start looking for a house or should we not? Alternatively, what if it sells in 2 days? What if it's a quick sale and a quick settlement? How are we going to live and where are we going to live? From the buyer's side, it's similar. They all have to be prepared. And sometimes when you have a buyer that's moving out of a rental property that they've lived in for some period of time and they have a lease, they're not really sure exactly when they're going to be able to terminate that lease and make everything work smoothly so that the move-in and move-out dates are going to work. But I think it's important to know that that's there and to know that those issues are out there and what kind of things you've got. Alternatives is the same thing. If we don't do this, then can we look at more houses? Is that going to be something that we should do? Relationships is crucially important as well. Oftentimes in real estate transactions, there isn't necessarily going to be a relationship between the buyer and the seller. Sometimes there is, and it's very important to find out. Run it by your clients. Do you know the sellers, Mr. and Mrs. Smith? Have you heard of these buyers, Mr. and Mrs. Jones? Just to find that out. What you're more often going to see is who the agent is on the other side and who the broker is on the other side. And I think that's something that's going to make a big difference to a lot of people, because I've watched this with agents that we work with. Sometimes they'll say, oh good, this is a perfect house for my clients, and then I get the, oh, I can't believe who the listing agent is. Or when an offer comes in, they'll do the same thing about who the buyer's agent is. They're not really prepared for dealing with the person on the other side. So it makes it kind of tricky sometimes when you're talking about relationships. I think one of the things you can also do in dealing in negotiation is to identify what the expected outcomes are going to be. And if you say that to your buyer, for example, you've got a buyer going in for a property that's listed for $599 and they want to offer $450, okay, well, what are the outcomes that we might see? Well, we might see a seller that just flat out rejects your offer. We might see a seller that doesn't even pay any attention to your offer, doesn't reject it, accept it, or do anything with it. They literally throw it right in the trash can. We might get a counteroffer at or above the list price. There are all these expected outcomes, and one of the things you can do is reduce the anxiety that your client feels and make the negotiation go more smoothly if they know what's going to happen or they can expect what's going to happen as a result. Again, part of that is knowing what those consequences are going to be. We're somewhat blessed and somewhat cursed in the real estate industry in the way things are structured, particularly in Maryland, in that the power of who's in charge of a negotiation really isn't as prevalent as it might be when there's a lot of face-to-face negotiation, as there is in other states and as there is in so many other industries. But power can be something that's interesting too. If you think about power switching back and forth, a buyer makes an offer on Tuesday afternoon and submits it to the seller, and they don't hear anything on Wednesday, and they don't hear anything on Thursday, and they're still wondering. Of course, if you're the buyer's agent, you know your phone's ringing about every 2 hours saying, what are they doing with our offer? You're calling the listing agent saying, I gave it to the seller, there's nothing more I can do. Who holds the power in that situation? Well, clearly the sellers are holding the power then. Now, when the buyer says, guess what, we're withdrawing our offer at 5 p.m. on Friday afternoon, the power suddenly may have switched a little bit and shifted over to the buyer's side to some degree. Same thing happens when there's going to be a counteroffer. Suddenly the buyers have the power. So knowing where you are and knowing who's got the power in a particular situation can sometimes be a very helpful part of that. And when you're going through the who, what, where, when, why, and how, I think it's important to literally write those 6 words down and identify who's involved. It's not going to do you any good when the person with whom you're regularly dealing and trying to come up with a transaction is not the actual buyer or seller. If you're dealing with someone in a representative capacity and they don't have decision-making power, it's not going to do you a world of good at all in trying to conduct a negotiation. We would run into that when I was doing litigation in situations where we're trying to resolve a personal injury case, and we would have an insurance adjuster show up at the settlement conferences who had no authority to do a settlement. It made no sense at all. We were kind of wasting our time even bothering. I think you're going to see that in real estate as well. When you have someone that doesn't have the power to make a decision, it's not going to do you a whole heck of a lot of good. The what we're going to touch on in a couple minutes, obviously we're talking about selling real estate for the most part, but there are a lot of components to a real estate contract besides just the property and the price itself. So it really makes a big difference. Where is going to be less of a factor as time goes by and technology gets better and better. I think that the situation you're seeing more and more often these days is nobody sees anybody else in the transaction face to face until we're actually at the settlement table. Nobody's going to get a home turf advantage by saying, well, we'll meet in my office or this office, unless there's something pretty specific and pretty important that has to be discussed face to face. Very rarely happens in our real estate transactions. The when is also becoming less important because pretty much you're expected too many times to be on call 24/7. Whenever somebody needs something that's involved in your business world, they expect you're going to respond right away. I'm not condoning or criticizing that in any way. It just seems like that's where a lot of the expectations are going these days. The why is obviously to make a transaction happen. We're going to try to make a deal go through, and how we're going to specify the methods that we're going to use in order to do this. I was fortunate to listen to a podcast by a gentleman named Tim Ferriss, and Tim was interviewing Mike Rowe. Mike Rowe is a Baltimore native. He grew up here, and his story is absolutely amazing. You probably just know him from Dirtiest Jobs, or he's a narrator on Deadliest Catch. He's done a lot of things, including sing with the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra using a fake resume. He's done absolutely phenomenal things, including working at QVC. Well, how he got the QVC job was one of the most interesting parts of his interview. And he said he was literally drinking a beer in a bar in Baltimore, and one of the guys that he was sitting with bet him he couldn't get a second call or a callback for appearing on a QVC as a host. And he said, well, I bet I can do that because I'm pretty good at talking. And they made the bet, and the guy said, well, guess what? The interview's in 15 minutes, and it's down the street, so you better get going. Mike Rowe went to the interview and sat down with the person, and the person pushed a pencil, a yellow number 2 pencil, across the table at him and said, you want to be on QVC? Sell me this pencil. Great story and a great discussion with Mike Rowe about how he kept talking about that pencil for a little bit over 8 minutes. Not only did it get a call back, but he got the job on the spot. He was the only person that was capable of sitting there and talking about a yellow number 2 pencil for the full 8 minutes. What he was doing during that interview was talking about the features of that particular pencil. And he would pick it up and talk about the color of the eraser and the color of the pencil itself and how it was so bright that you wouldn't be able to lose it among all the papers on your desk. And he went on and on about features, physical features of the pencil itself. And they are important to know in all respects when you're negotiating for a product or even for a home. But I want you to think a minute about what goes alongside features, and that's benefits. And benefits are really what I think you should be focusing on in any kind of negotiation. What is a benefit? A benefit is a feature that the person on the other side values. So it's not just a feature. You can stand in front of someone and start talking about that yellow number 2 pencil all day long, and if they don't really care about the color, spending time talking about the color is kind of a waste of time. what you got to do is find out from them, what do they want and what do they need? And finding that out helps you hone your negotiation down to something that is actually going to turn into a transaction. And you can apply this to real estate across the board. Again, your job as a buyer's agent would be to go out and talk to your buyers and find out what they're looking for. Not just the style of house, the number of bedrooms, the number of bathrooms and those things, but get more specific. What are they really looking for? What's the ideal dream home for them? And then what are the other things that they can put in the wants category that are still benefits, but aren't going to really be a make or break part of the deal? When you can find that for your buyers and then convey to the sellers other benefits, like the home is vacant and is moving condition and ready to go as soon as they're ready to settle, maybe that's a benefit for your buyers. If they have 2 more months on their lease and are not in a hurry about moving, you can talk about having a quick settlement all day long and it just doesn't make any difference. So features is an important thing to know, but benefits is what's going to make the transaction happen. That's what's going to make the deal. Let me give you an example about the why portion of negotiation. And it's called the orange example. And you're going to see this if you do any research into any of the treatises on negotiation. They talk about it all the time. The orange example is you've got 2 chefs working in a kitchen. They both see the orange on the counter. They both reach for it at the same time, and they both want the orange. They start to have an argument over the orange and why one of them should have the orange versus the other one. You know, I need it to make lunch, and you're only making dinner. Dinner's not for several more hours. I need to make lunch right now. You can go out and buy another orange if you want to. They could go back and forth about why one deserves the orange and the other one doesn't. Well, if you're the head chef, one of the things that you can do is you can say to those people, you know what, why don't we do this? We're going to split the difference. We're going to cut that orange in half, and each one of you can get a half, because that's going to be a win-win, right? Well, if you're the smart executive chef that's running that kitchen, you say to each one of the 2 people, what are you going to use the orange for? Why do you want the orange? And if you talk to them a little bit, you find out from them that splitting that orange isn't going to be the answer. Because what they really want is one of the 2 chefs wants to use the peel for orange zest in order to create his recipe, while the other chef wants to use the juice that's from the inside of the orange. I guess we could find a 3rd chef that would want to use the pulp inside as well. But that's just a great example of 2 people wanting the same exact thing. And until they articulate why they want it and the things that they're going to use it for, we're not able to really help them in a negotiation and try to get them where they want to be. I've got another example, and that is the what example, and that's the real estate contract. A real estate contract has a lot of components to it. And really what we're talking about when we're dealing with a real estate contract are what I call the business terms. Now, no matter where you're working, you're using usually a board form. If you're in the Maryland, D.C. region, you're probably using the GCAR form. If you're almost anywhere else in Maryland, and even in the D.C. region, they also use the MAR form. It's probably the most prevalent one that's out there. And there are a lot of places in both of those forms where you have to fill in information. What's the price going to be is pretty simple. What property we're talking about, also pretty straightforward. But think about it. Does the property include an extra lot? Does it have a parking space with it that's fee simple or even rental? Does it have a boat slip? What appliances are included? Is there any furniture involved that's going to be transmitted as part of this transaction as well? You've got a settlement date that's involved that can move forward or backward depending upon what the parties want. You've got the issue of inspections, warranties, and repairs. I always say that the deposit amount is something that's worth negotiating, and it's interesting because under the MAR contract, that's very rarely something that's discussed, because the seller under an MAR contract has to still prove damages on a buyer's breach. So the amount of the deposit is not irrelevant, but somewhat less important to a seller. Under the GCAR contract, the deposit is forfeited. So you see many, many agents in the DC market who negotiate that deposit because it really shows how much the borrower or buyer is willing to give up if they're going to default, because that money's going to go straight to the seller and to the listing agent in the event that there is a default. So the deposit amount can be a big deal. Financing also has to go in there, as whether it's going to be a contingency or not. The sale of a home by the buyer or the purchase of a new home by the seller could be a component. And then issues of possession before or after settlement can all be crucial in determining whether you've got the right kind of terms in there. And again, I think there's a balancing act that has to happen here. You don't just start off with the price and say, you asked $375,000, we're offering $355,000, we should be good. I think you have to take all of these into consideration in negotiating back and forth. And frankly, you're not making the decisions. You're talking to your clients, you're talking to the buyers and sellers, and you have to educate them a little bit on the fact that all of these terms matter and all of these terms make a huge difference in the final picture. It's not just the price. It's not just how that works. There's another how example that I picked up in some of the literature, and it's ways to solve problems, how to solve a problem that's out there. And I wanted to have a great picture of a Boeing 787 to show you, and I had one, and it just didn't come out. It was pixelated and didn't come out particularly well. But the how example was this. Boeing wanted to sell those planes to Japan. They wanted to use them in their airlines, but they couldn't afford them. They didn't have it budgeted. So that sort of should have ended the negotiation. Here's what my price is. I can't lower it anymore. You don't have the money, so I guess we're finished. Well, some creative people that were involved in the sale of Boeing 787s to Japan said, well, you know what? We need to get our wing components made somewhere, and we need to get some other electronic items made somewhere anyway. We haven't set out the bids for that to anybody else. How about if we let one of the Japanese companies make the wing components and make some of the other things for the plane, and we'll give you a fair price for those. That'll put some cash into Japan. They also managed to do some other things with trade negotiations to make it all happen. At the end, it worked out fine. It worked out where they did actually buy some of the Boeing 787s and actually have them in use today. So just being creative in these things can oftentimes help a significant amount. The one thing that everyone talks about as being the nightmare of negotiation is an automobile purchase. It's something that many people love, but I think more people hate. They hate it because they feel at a significant disadvantage when they walk into a car dealership. And really, the reason for that is that, say 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, the dealer held all the cards. They knew everything that was going to happen while you knew essentially nothing about what was going to happen. You didn't know what they paid for the car. You didn't know anything else. Well, now that's completely changed. We can get on the internet and find out almost as much information as a dealer has. And arming yourself with that information, finding out how much other people are paying, sharing that cooperative knowledge can put you in a much different position than we used to find ourselves in when we go in to deal with a car dealer. A lot of tough decisions still to make. And it can be incredibly difficult. I'm pretty sure that guy right there is not giving you a warm and fuzzy feeling about buying your car. Other areas where we see practical examples of needing to negotiate are divorce scenarios. These are the quintessential element of negotiation, and there are so many components that go into that, and you really truly need to break it down into each of the component parts. I've always found that that was the best thing. Is to break it down into grounds, custody, vegetation, child support, alimony, property issues. Once you've done that, there's actually no reason not to go ahead and start cutting them off one at a time. If you reach an agreement on one of them, then knock it out, write it out, and get it done. It really helps to do that sometimes. So even if you were to do that in a real estate transaction, if your party is having a huge problem with one aspect of it, for example, your buyer doesn't want to pay the price that the sellers say is their bottom line, that's the last thing they're going to do, then maybe you focus on some of the other issues and point out to the listing agent that some of these other issues were things that your buyer was willing to give in on in order to get us further on down the road as far as getting a transaction completed. So that's just, again, another example of where we're going to run into a negotiation on a pretty regular basis. Let's talk a little bit more about how to prepare for negotiation. If you have a face-to-face negotiation, a couple of things I would strongly recommend. Eat something before you do it, drink something before you do it, and go to the bathroom before you start it. I will never forget that 20 some odd years ago we had a face-to-face mediation to try to resolve a case, and the other lawyer set it for 11:30 in his office. His office was in a location that was probably 20 minutes from the closest place to buy any food, and I was silly and naive enough to not recognize the technique that he was using, and he had us show up there and then delay the mediation as much as he possibly could. And we got to about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and my clients and I were starved. We were thirsty. There was nowhere we could conveniently go to get those needs taken care of. But the other side had done it. They'd already eaten before we got there. They'd already had something to drink before we got there. So if you run into that situation where you're going to make even a listing appointment because you're negotiating your own commission at that point, don't go when you're not physically prepared to spend the time to do it. So make sure that you're ready to go. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about conducting the negotiation. This is the next step. So once you've prepared for it, you've found out everything you possibly can about the subject matter that in the negotiation, which is what you're going to buy or sell, and you found out everything you can about the other side's needs and wants, and you've identified your own needs and wants. How do you go about doing this negotiation? Couple things. First and foremost, put away any distractions that you've got. Get rid of it, put it away, especially your phone. I think that smartphones are probably the greatest thing of this millennium for us to be able to use to get information, to get us to our destinations, to communicate with other people. But when you have the opportunity to have a face-to-face meeting with someone, a face-to-face contact with someone, the smartphone is nothing but a distraction. Even just looking down to see if a text message came in or see who the call came from takes your brain away from the focus that you're supposed to have, which is on your client, takes your attention away from the things that you're supposed to be working on. I turned my cell phone off before I started this webinar. Hopefully the rest of you did as well. I think that's an important part in order to pay attention, because the problem is sometimes you don't get a second chance at what's come at you. I see this a lot with people that are watching movies or television shows. They keep on wanting to rewind to go back. Sometimes you don't get a second chance with a relationship, and when someone sees that you care more about what's happening on your cell phone than you do about their deal, it sort of tells them exactly where you stand and where they stand with you, which is not necessarily good. I think it's an important thing to shut down. On the other hand, I said in the very beginning of this webinar that there was a possibility that some of these techniques aren't going to work every time. If you think that having a distraction there and you have somebody call you during a meeting or during a negotiation and that's going to help you, then maybe that is something that you want to put in there. I think in general it's probably not, but sometimes it's going to happen. Sometimes you can do that. Once you've reached negotiations, start to define the terms. You've got the W's and the H at the very end, but go through them aloud with the other side. Say, hey, look, I understand that you want to sell this house for $374,000. I get that. We only have the ability to get a loan that'll put us in the price range of $353,000. This is what the things that I want. These are the things that I need. Can you tell me what you want and need so that we can try to come to some kind of consensus? Obviously, we're talking about face-to-face. Your job as real estate professionals is a little bit more difficult because you don't have that direct contact with the other side as much as it would be nice to have. So you're kind of going through each other. The point is there's no reason to keep any of this stuff secret. Letting it out there and letting them know what the needs and wants are is a great tool to try to get you going in the right path toward getting something negotiated. Identifying those needs and wants is the most important part of this whole thing. Again, that sort of sets you on the road to get things going. I apologized earlier that we're going to use a Latin word, and this is the essential part of need. The sine qua non just means essentially it's the only thing that really matters. There can be terms that are absolutely the last straw for your buyer or for your seller that they absolutely have to have. We see this a fair amount in people that are in very stressful situations of going to be losing their house and they don't have very much equity. If you come in and offer $354,000 for their house, but they owe $390,000 and they have to settle within the next 2 weeks or else there's going to be a foreclosure sale, you're not really going to be able to get anywhere. There's a sine qua non there, which is a minimum price that that seller needs to get. There's also a sine qua non of the time. It all has to happen within a particular period of time, or else the property's going to go to foreclosure. Again, part of the role here, help each other through this. Help the other side, give them ideas, and be creative in ways that we can push this off a little bit and make sure that everybody gets what they need at the end of it. To me, the most crucial element in all of this is listening. Again, I sympathize with the structure that we have in negotiating real estate transactions right now, because you're not really listening to the buyer or the seller when you're on the other side, so to speak. It's usually going through at least one other agent, sometimes two other agents. So the point is, you have to listen even more carefully. You got to listen to what these people are actually saying and ask questions. Make sure you understand that what they're saying is really what they're talking about. Now, I have a couple of pointers that I think fit in with most real estate transactions, and it kind of applies to both buyers and sellers. And I've been using this in a couple of my CE classes, and some of the agents that I've worked with have actually tried these techniques, and they say that they're working fantastically well because it differentiates them from other agents. I think the differentiation part is important, but I think there's another component to that that's more important, and that is when you're sitting down with a seller doing a listing presentation, or you're sitting down with a buyer to do a buyer-agent presentation and ask them what they want. If you show them that you really care about what their needs and wants are, and that that's what the focus is, instead of what you can throw out at them, I think you've made a big step. I think that most people that are doing presentations like this are focusing more on the features. So, for example, they may pull out a glossy pamphlet that they used on the last property that they actually sold. So that's a feature that they have to offer. They might identify the fact that they have a great warranty program that will cover the seller during the time that the property is listed. They might have all these other different things, and so they're handing them piece of paper after piece of paper after piece of paper to try to prove that they're the right agent for the job. And again, this applies either to the buyer side or the seller side. But what about the agent that goes in and keeps all of that information in their briefcase or on the floor? What about the agent that goes in and takes a blank legal pad or a blank sheet of paper and puts it down in front of them with a pen and just looks at the prospective client and says, tell me what you're looking for in an agent. Tell me what you want me to do for you. Tell me what you see me doing in the next 1 week, 2 months, 6 months to try to help you get a property. Tell me what you want out of me, and tell me what you want in a property. I think that makes a big difference in how you're approaching things and how you're looking at things, and I think it says a lot about you to the client, and it gives the client an idea of who you are and what you're about. I think it's a little bit better maybe than coming out and throwing a bunch of paper at them. Not that that paper is not important, because it's a great differentiator. You can show that your office was the best in sales in a particular area. That's fantastic. But what people really want is to talk about themselves, and they want to hear that somebody cares about what they think. And if you start that way, I think it's going to make for a much more successful real estate transaction. There are people out there that are bad faith negotiators. We talked about it in the very beginning when I tried to fool you into thinking that this was going to be a 3-hour webinar. That's not fun. It's not easy to deal with, but I think it's one of those things that if you identify it early on and as fast as you can, it's going to help. I had a negotiation one time where we sat down with the other side, and the other side immediately pulled out a lawsuit and served my client at the table. Needless to say, that negotiation did not go well or even very long. It was kind of a complete waste of time, and it wasn't really very fruitful. To me, why do that at the very beginning? Why not discuss the possibility of resolving things during a meeting, and then if it doesn't work out, then you pull out the lawsuit and serve the papers? At the end of the day, it probably wasn't the best way to go about it. I'm not sure that bad faith negotiators last very long in any business. Now, what do you do when you start a negotiation? Well, one of the things you're going to be talking about is price. And again, one of the things that they say in negotiating is either you do want to throw out a number first, or you don't want to throw out a number first. And we're not talking about people that are buying things at a yard sale here. We're talking about people that are buying real estate. So the setting the anchor or establishing the price doesn't apply quite as much, but think about this. Whatever price a property is listed at has already set the anchor. It's already set the parameters. You can say all day long that that number doesn't make any sense and it doesn't do any good to have it out there because it's not going to be sustained when we get an appraisal. But at the end of the day, that's what everybody's thinking. When a property is listed for $950,000, you're not thinking you're going to get it for $450,000. So it sort of does set the anchor to a certain degree. So I think that's kind of what we have. The next anchor on the opposite end is going to be when the buyer throws in that lowball offer and gets things moving. We can also talk about ranges. If you're talking about a piece of something other than real estate that you're selling and you're talking about setting ranges, you can say, well, you know, I think we could probably come in and make a contract of this between $10,000 and $12,000. Well, if you're the one paying the money, you only hear $10,000. You don't hear $12,000. There is no $12,000. So ranges are sometimes a waste of time, but again, it can get the conversation going. Refer back for 2 seconds to that bad faith negotiator. You don't want to be the one that's faking or lying to the other side, but you do have to set some kind of reasonable parameters. One thing that works a lot is ridiculous specificity. So instead of offering $450,000, say you offer $456,789.12. Everyone looks at that and says, where the heck did that number come from? These people have really gotten specific. I wonder if they went to their lender and found out exactly the most they could pay. Maybe this is really that number. But it really has an impact on people. For some people, people are more willing to accept a very specific number and not negotiate against it than they are to work against a very round number. One of the things that I think is a kiss of death in negotiation is to talk about, I think we're willing to pay about $450,000. Well, that's sort of throwing out an anchor, but it's also telling the other side, give me a number that you think is real, because I just said something that I did not think was real. I know we're not going to come up to that kind of a number. The other thing, and I think this may help you when you're dealing with buyers and sellers, if you have a seller that says, I am not going to take $1 less than $399,000. And you say to them, well, if I got you a contract at $398,999, wouldn't you take that? And they go, well, yeah, of course I would. Okay, so just so we're clear then, the $1, not $1 less, you didn't really mean that. What you meant was you're kind of feeling pushed. So why don't we talk about realistic? Let's see how far down we can really go where you're not willing to say, I won't go $1 less. Definitely something to think about. The part of being in the negotiation is being civil and being a gentle person. Proving the other side wrong doesn't get you what you want. Arguing doesn't get you what you want. Stating positions is the way you get what you want. There are a lot of things that happen in negotiating that I think can buy you some time. You can ask a question which is, gosh, you know, I understand why you want that number, but how am I going to do that? That buys you time, gives you time to think about it, gives them your problem, hands your problem right over to them and says, you come up with a solution for me. I can't come up with this. You come up with a solution for me. It changes things around and it sort of lets the other side focus because maybe they realize that what they're asking you to do isn't as reasonable as they originally thought. The other thing to do is always explain why you want something before what you want. That sort of sets the preface. For example, if you go in to buy appliance at the store, so you're going to buy an oven at the store and it's $400, if you go in and say, gosh, you know, I'm willing to pay $350 for this, you know, I saw it down the street for $350. Wouldn't it be a lot nicer for that salesperson, and wouldn't they be a lot less likely to shut you down if you went in and said, gosh, you know, I was just in the store down the street and they were selling this exact same oven for $350. Would you guys be willing to go down to that price because you're at $400 right now? It just gets the ball rolling in a much better way by wording things slightly different. One of the other great tools you can use in negotiating is to just stop talking. People feel the incredible need to fill that silence gap and to say things. When they do, you get information, and when you get information, you get power, and when you get power, you get a better opportunity to make the deal happen the way you want to see it happen. So it kind of makes sense sometimes to just stop talking and let the other side talk. Whether it's on the telephone or whether it's in person, that can be a huge tool, a great tool for you to use. You also have to have some solid basis for your argument on anything that you're going to want. If you just throw out a number that's a price because I feel like that's the fair price for me to pay, not going to carry quite as much weight. You can use all kinds of silly reasons. You can say that well, I saw another property that I thought was just like this, and all the features seem to be the same, and it was only this much money. So that's what I'm comparing it with. One thing to do, focus on that, and I think you're going to have a whole heck of a lot easier time negotiating. Walking away from a negotiation is not the end of the world. I think every single one of you has probably had a transaction where at least one party or the other has walked away and then they've come back to the table and ultimately made a deal. It does a lot of things. It gives you time to think as the person walking away to say, is this really important to me? Is buying this property the most important thing? On the other hand, the seller, if they turn down the offer, suddenly the house has been on the market again for another week, you haven't had any showings, nothing's happened. Well, the most important part of that, if you're going to walk away professionally, walk away courteously, recap the discussion, state where you are. It can be in writing or verbally. Just say, here's where I think we are. You were at 490,000. We were at 499,000. I guess we're just going to have to put it back on the market and let somebody else come in for right now. Sometimes you can do a final offer, and you can take their offer, and it's called reductio ad absurdum, and that is to make it sound so ridiculous. You talk to them about what they want and then say, you want me to offer you $400,000. Meanwhile, I've looked at the assessment of the property and it's $325,000. I've looked at the Zestimate from Zillow for the property and it's $340,000. I've looked at a bunch of comparables that my agent has given me and the value that my agent thinks it's worth, and this is the number they have, but you're still stuck at $400,000. As long as we understand each other, then at least we can walk away feeling like we did everything we could. And that just gets everybody thinking about the situation a little bit. Always stay solution-oriented, not rigidly positioned. If you just say no, no, no all the time and aren't willing to offer some kind of alternative or say, I'd be willing to accept that if some other things changed, it carries the day. It can move things forward. Smile. A smile does so much to tell people where you are mentally. So does a frown. So does making an ugly face. But smiling keeps things on a much more professional level and keeps people talking a little bit. Being creative is an amazingly important part of this, and I think that's one of the things that the best agents do all the time is come up with creative ways to make the deal go through when ordinarily it might not otherwise. Obviously avoiding the bad faith negotiation unless that's the tool that's going to get you the deal, get to the transaction. There are a lot of things you can look for when you're dealing with a negotiation. There's the 738-55 rule, which says that 7% of what we perceive are the actual words that are used, 38% of what we receive are the tone, volume, and pattern that those words are delivered, and finally 55% is the facial and body expressions that we get along with the words. So thinking about that, why aren't we having more face-to-face meetings? Why aren't we sitting down with both agents and the buyers and sellers and knocking some of these transactions out that otherwise we wouldn't think could happen? I know a lot of you are probably shaking your heads and saying, no way, I never want to see that happen. But at the end of the day, if we're only using 7% of what's in the words and taking that away, how is email working for us? Probably not as well as we would like it to. Again, just another tool out there to think about, and when you get a real impasse and nobody's getting anywhere, nobody's budging, sometimes that face-to-face meeting, even if you hire a facilitator to do it, someone that's not representing the buyer or the seller, sometimes that can really help to get you to the contract and then ultimately to the settlement table. Never interrupt unless it happens to be to your significant advantage, but it could, if you continuously interrupt, it could end the negotiation, it could end the discussion. Sometimes breaking your goals into smaller tasks is a good thing, and then I would always ask that question, how am I supposed to do that of the other side? Ask them what you're supposed to do. Empathy is also something to have. It does not mean sympathy. It does not say that you agree with the other side. It just says you acknowledge their position and you understand it. It really can help you move a lot faster through a transaction if you show some empathy and show the other side, hey, I get where you're coming from. Here's why I can't do that. Let's figure out a way to get there together. makes a big difference. I think proper wording takes a significant amount of practice. It takes a lot of time. I happen to have started when I was beginning to practice the law of writing everything down. Whenever I had a trial, whenever I had something to present, I would write the entire thing out longhand. Over time, I got some shortcuts and I got a little faster with it. I got a little better with it. Now I kind of rehearse everything in my head. It all literally goes through my brain. So when I'm driving in the car or getting ready to go to sleep at night, I'm rehearsing something I have to present or something I have to say. So usually when I actually say something intelligent, which is a pretty rare thing, everyone will go, wow, you thought of that right off the top of your head. That's fantastic. I didn't. I thought of that 2 days ago when I was rehearsing what was going to happen. I knew the question was going to come. You need to practice those same things when you're dealing with the person on the other side. You have to anticipate what they're going to ask you, and you have to have an answer ready for them. If you have a property that's in really horrible condition, somebody's going to ask you why. Somebody's going to ask you how you can expect to get this amount of money for it. You've got to have an answer ready, and rehearsing those answers is going to make it a heck of a lot easier for you. Now, we're running a little bit out of time, so I'm going to skip through some of these. Splitting the difference always seems like a way of bridging to get you from one position to the other. I just finished a book last weekend that I think was a really good book, not necessarily just on negotiation, but otherwise. And it was about a guy who's an FBI hostage negotiator. And you know what? Splitting the difference isn't so good for him. As he put it, if I have 4 hostages and I talk to the terrorist that has them, I can't say, well, hey, can you give me 2 of them back and go ahead and kill the other 2? Splitting the difference there doesn't really help. So sometimes it doesn't work, and you have to think about the transaction to see if it really does. If you've got a party that's way off on one side or the other, it's not going to really help you much either. That's the book that I finished this weekend by Chris Voss. It's an interesting read, really kind of fun to go through. Some of these next topics are related to what he had to say. No doesn't always mean no. No sometimes just means a way to get the conversation going in a different direction. Sometimes it means just, hey, let's stop for a second and then talk about some other aspect of it. It definitely helps you focus the negotiation a little bit. So listening to what the no really means is an important part of it. So don't always take it as we're shutting this down. Sometimes it can be try again. Sometimes it can be something else. So listen to that. And if you can, again, the tone and body language are going to be 55% of what you get. So if they're sitting there with a scowl on their face and their arms crossed across the table from you saying no, that may mean something different than if they were more smiling, leaning forward, and anxious to engage with you. Fail forward is one of my favorite things, and what I like about it is it sort of sounds like fall forward, which means it's something bad, and also means you failed at something. I don't ever look at anything as having been a failure. Anytime that a deal has not been transacted or hasn't been completed, I know I've learned something and my clients have learned something. So if we fail in making a deal, it doesn't mean we failed in general. It just means we failed and that we learned something. We learned about the house, we learned about that particular seller, we learned about that particular buyer, and we're going to take that knowledge and move forward with it. So we're going to fail forward and actually gain something from it. I put this slide up very quickly to talk about black swans, and it is a technique or a phenomenon that happens, that comes up in negotiations sometimes, and it's the thing that you never had any idea was going to happen, and it happens, and when you find out about it, it can make a huge difference. Not going to spend a lot of time on it because literally there have been books written about it, but I at least wanted to mention the term. If you haven't heard it before, you probably will hear it again. Deadlines are a fascinating part of this. Deadlines are usually artificial. Deadlines, for example, a car dealer that says, gosh, you know, we've got to get this done in the next 15 minutes or my boss is going to sell that car to somebody else. Let him sell it to somebody else. Deadlines are usually artificial. They're a good way to get people moving and good way to get people sort of off the spot that they're stuck in, but they're usually artificial, and don't let it get you. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to do something within the deadlines that they've set. In the United States, we have a value for time that's very different than almost anywhere else. We're always valuing it. There have been a lot of negotiations over the years where time has been played against American companies. There was one where a gentleman traveled to a foreign country, and the very first thing that they asked him was, you know, how long do you have? Are you going to stay in our country so that you can see all the products that we have to sell and then make the deal with us? And he told them, oh, I'm going to be here for 1 week. They didn't engage in one little bit of negotiating for the entire first 6.5 days. And when he's got his bag packed in the conference room is when they hit him with the negotiation. They knew he had to make a deal, and he had very, very little time to do it. Well, there is an artificial deadline that they created as a result of our desire to have time really matter for something. The same thing happens sometimes when a buyer gets sent to another place to buy a particular product. If you send them to Hawaii to try to decide whether to buy the product, that might take a whole year to figure out. Why would he ever want to come home? So it's really important to understand that sometimes our value of time is not the same thing as it is to everybody, especially in our multicultural environment. Sometimes the best thing you can do in a transaction is to walk away. That's the terminating the negotiation. Walk away. Don't say or do anything that's going to close the doors to the discussions. Keep everything real, keep it polite, and sleep on it a little bit. That way, sometimes the termination can become a starting point for a new negotiation. My last point is don't leave the table if you've got a deal unless everything is written down. This is particularly true in our industry, and we see it, unfortunately, all the time. Someone that has actually got the deal verbally, guess what? If you have a verbal deal, you don't have a deal. So if you have the opportunity, the deal is hot, make sure that you get it done and get it written down while the iron is hot. If you're not dealing with real estate, you're not using those forms, write it down on a napkin if you have to. Long and the short of it is you need to make sure that you've got everything finalized before you walk away from the table. I thank you very much for the time that you've spent with me today talking about negotiation. Again, I think we barely scratched the surface and had to rush through to get everything done in an hour, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you've got. Okay, I'm having a little trouble reading the questions, but I've got one here. I have found that clients are very reluctant to reveal up front how much they are willing to negotiate. They want to hold out until there is pressure, which makes them realize they may have to negotiate. Do you have any ideas on how to get through to a client to convince them to open up and reveal what they are holding back? Well, the one thing that is really interesting, I think, about this is that every single person is going to be different. I think what you can do as an agent is to set the expectations and try to tell them what probably is going to happen. Again, it's their transaction, not yours, and all you're really doing is facilitating it. So I think the best thing you can do is to tell them sometimes this is going to work out the best, sometimes it's really not going to work out the best, and see how it goes from there. All right, I'm trying to get to some of these other questions. They're very hard to see. All right.
Hey, Robert.
Yes.
Hi. Is there any possible way that we can get a copy of the slides from the presentation?
Certainly.
Okay, awesome. I would like to, I'll work with you on getting that and maybe distributing them to everybody that was part of the webinar.
Happy to do it.
Okay, awesome. I think we have a few more questions. Let me see if we can send them over to you.
I see one question, which what is negative / false negotiating ... I candidly haven't heard that term, but I'd be willing to bet that someone has defined it. It's usually in negotiating. It's fascinating. It's usually psychology that are defining some of those terms. I think really what I was talking about, bad faith negotiating. That's what we're talking about with negative or false negotiating. Is saying something maybe not true or giving a false impression that makes the big difference. Oh, I also see one that says, can you please give me email so you can send the references that we talked about in the beginning. I have two email references. One is bflynn, F-L-Y-N-N, at libtitle.com, and my other address is rflynn, I, at gmail.com. Either one of those, and again, I'm happy to respond to people. It's usually the best way to get hold of me anyway. Next question I see, are you recommending that a buyer agent present an offer face-to-face in the listing with sellers present? Fantastic question. What's interesting about that is that if you think back to before the time of buyer agency, a lot of times there was an agent involved in the transaction when there were two who wasn't really representing the buyer, but was assisting the buyer in putting the documents together. And back then, a lot of times, both agents would appear with the seller to present the contract and explain what the buyer had told the one agent. Even though they were representing the seller at the time, they knew what the buyer wanted because they helped them put together the offer. So with that as a history, a lot of times that really worked out well because there was a little bit more of a direct communication. I know you've probably played the game telephone where you sit in a circle with 10 people and one person whispers something to the next person and it goes around the circle. By the time it comes back, it's a completely unrecognizable subject matter. And I think sometimes that can happen when we have too many steps to go through to communicate from buyers to sellers in a transaction. So makes it pretty tough when you do that. Got it. Question, how do you negotiate with a party, open parens, agent, close parens, that is extremely difficult, i.e. rude or lazy? You know, I hear this a lot, and I know that all of you are dealing with people that are a lot. If you think of the 80-20 rule, which was what most businesses premised upon, 20% of the agents are going to be doing 80% of the business, and they're probably the better agents involved. That means you've got a pretty big pool of agents that are not going to be as proficient as the rest. So you're probably going to run into them on some occasions. It's pretty difficult, but again, I think you got to remember who you're representing and what you want to see happen. You're representing a party, so doing almost anything you can to get it done is going to matter, and I think most agents are willing to do that. If it gets to be to the point of either being incredibly unfair or perhaps unethical, I think that's a good time to discuss it with your broker and have your broker get involved. They can call the other broker and try to see what you can do. Maybe it's just about the other agent not having the time to put into it. And if you're going to do their job for them, then maybe the commission split should be a little bit different. That's a tough one. Next questions. I'd love to talk about the black swan. It says, can you talk about black swan a little more? There are so many interpretations of what a black swan is. And sometimes it's a huge technological advantage. Like one example is if you had told me 10 years ago that I would buy most of my goods and products from a company called Amazon and have those things delivered to me 2 days later, I would have thought you were crazy. Well, Amazon has done some things that didn't seem like they were possible, and part of it was because they got a little bit lucky. The black swan for Amazon was that they were able to create a shipping model that was much less expensive than anybody else. And nowadays, particularly we're going to see in Baltimore sometime fairly soon, we're going to see packages dropped off at locations by drone within an hour of the time that you order it. So phenomenal things happening out there. That is just one example of a black swan. I can tell you if you Google it, you will run into so many more. It's pretty phenomenal. Next question, what are the top 3 to 4 areas you can use to negotiate on the price of a home from a buyer's point of view? I'm guessing a little bit by what you mean by areas, and I guess you're really talking about resources or sources you can use. You know, you all as licensed professionals and members of MARIS and MAR and local boards, have a lot of resources at your disposal. You can pull up comparable prices and even comparable listings that can help your buyers a lot to pinpoint a price of a home. You know, one thing that it sounds a little crazy and haven't seen it very often, but sometimes a buyer will hire an appraiser to do an appraisal before they make an offer, and that way they really know that they're paying the right number. I always like to use the numbers that help me the most. Whenever I'm buying a property, I like to go in and to look at what helps me. If I look at the assessment value of the property, which is supposed to approximate fair market value, and it favors me, I jump all over it. I use it like crazy. And if it doesn't favor me, I just pretend it didn't exist. If a Zestimate helps me in negotiating with the seller, I will jump all over it. Getting an opinion from a third party like an appraiser or another agent, that can sometimes be a huge help as well. So those are all, I think, good tools in trying to find things out. Next question, what is the best book on negotiation you can recommend? That's a great question, and I will say that the book that I read last week, the Splitting the Difference book, was a good one. And this is going to sound a little bit silly, and it's almost a little embarrassing for me to say, the best resource I have ever seen on the subject of negotiating is Wikipedia. If you go to negotiation in Wikipedia, it gives a very, very lengthy description of the various styles and types of negotiating that can be done, but it also gives you the resources that you can go to, some of the best books that are out there, some of the best things that are available as far as articles and things like that. Again, I have some articles that I've read. I'm happy to share those with anybody. I PDF'd them and saved them because I knew I'd never be able to find them again. But I think going to that Wikipedia source and looking at that can probably give you a pretty good idea. I am a little bit smitten right now with the work of Tim Ferriss. His newest book called Tools of Titans is not my favorite, but his other three books, which is 4-Hour Workweek, 4-Hour Body, and 4-Hour Chef, all have negotiation as a subtopic in various things. And I also listen to his podcasts all the time in the hopes that I'll pick up some information from him. So those would be the sources I would go to if I were looking for more books on negotiation, but there are a lot of them out there. Okay, I think I don't see any other questions that I haven't hit yet.
We are done here. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. It's been a pleasure having you.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Everybody else, the webinar was recorded and will be up on our YouTube page next week sometime. You will get information sent to you about when that's up. So thank you, everybody. Have a nice day.